John's Gospel opens with the majestic words, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." At least that's the traditional translation of this verse. But if we turn to a Jehovah's Witness Bible, the NWT, we read, "And the Word was a God." So which translation is right? Let's look at the Greek. En arche ein halagos, kai halagos ein proston theon, kai theos ein halagos. Now we need to deal with a couple preliminary things. First of all, theon and theos are the same word. There's no difference in meaning between them. The difference in ending is because one is in the accusative case and one is in the nominative case. Now what does that mean? Well, in English, we determine the subject and object by word order. For instance, in the sentence, Bob hit Joe, we know that the verb is hit. But how do we know who hit whom? We know that Bob is the subject, or the one hitting Joe, because of word order. But in Greek, the subject and object are determined by case ending. So when it comes to the word theos, the os ending lets you know that he's the subject. The on ending lets you know that he's the object. A second issue that comes up is over the use of the article. People sometimes claim that the true God has the article, which simply isn't true. If that were the case, then what would you do with verses 6, 12, 13, 18, etc.? Because God in each of those verses lacks the article. Are these verses not speaking about the true God? There are three clauses in John 1:1. Clause 1 speaks of the pre-existence of the Word. He was existing whenever the beginning took place. That means that he's outside of time. He's eternal. See my previous video on this. Clause 2 speaks of the coexistence of the Word with God and the relationship he had with God. Clause 3 speaks about the self-existence of the Word as God. The word theos is not a proper name. It's a title that asserts something about someone. Dad, for instance, is a title that asserts that the person in question is a father. The Romans had a pantheon of gods, but the Jews and Christians believed that there was one and only one God, the God of Israel. Now that's really important for the next clause because John is a monotheist and would not have claimed that Jesus was a God. Now throughout John's Gospel, the Father is the one who is over and over identified as God. Nearly 80 times God is used as a title for the Father, and only 3 times is it used for Jesus. But when Jesus is called God, it is very, very significant. So in clause 2, the referent of the title God is the Father. So we can read the clause like this: the Word was with God, the Father. There's no argument over clause 2, but what do we do with clause 3? There are 3 main arguments for the translation, the Word was God. 1, an argument from silence. 2, an argument from John's theology. And 3, an argument from grammar. First, an argument from silence. If John wanted to say that the Word was a God, or simply divine, then he was a really, really bad communicator. There are 5 ways that John could have written this clause. 1, he could have said, halagos ein hatheos. The Word was the God. This, however, would be modalism. It would be claiming that the Word was equated with the God whom he was with in clause 2, contradicting that clause. 2, he could have said, halagos ein theos. The Word was a God. This would have been the clearest and most unambiguous way to say that Jesus was a God. But that isn't what he wrote. 3, he could have said, halagos ein theos. The Word was divine. This wouldn't tell us to what extent the Word was divine, but it could imply that since the Word was only divine, that he was subordinate to the God in clause 2. 3, he could have said, halagos theos ein. The Word was God. This would have been the same meaning as the clause John actually wrote, but with a slightly different emphasis. This would emphasize that the Word, rather than someone else, had the nature of God. But John wanted to emphasize that the Word had the same nature as God, rather than the nature of something else. So John could have written it in these 4 ways, but he didn't. He wrote it like this: Theos ein halagos. The Word was God. John pushes theos to the front for emphasis. He wants his reader to know that the Word is assumed within the identity of the God of Israel. This is his Jewish monotheism coming into play. The Word shares the essence of the Father, but the Word is not the person of the Father. The Word is the God of Israel, but he is not the person of the Father. Now an argument from John's theology. John was a first-century monotheistic Jew who believed that there was one and only one God. He lived in a pluralistic world with people claiming that Zeus was God, that Artemis was God, and that there was a whole host of other gods out there. But John believed that there was only one God, the God of Israel, who created all things. Therefore, since John wasn't a polytheist, he would not have claimed that Jesus was a God. Now finally, an argument from grammar. There's an established grammatical rule that says that an anarthrous preverbal predicate nominative is normally qualitative, sometimes definite, and only rarely indefinite. GWs will cite Acts 28:6 in support of the indefinite use of a God. But if you actually go to that text, it's not an example of an anarthrous preverbal predicate nominative. God comes after the copulative verb. Since the indefinite use is rare, the context must clearly show that it ought to be translated as an indefinite, and it doesn't. Now it could be definite, as king is in John 1:49, but again, context rules that out since it would conflict with clause 2. Theos is clearly qualitative, which means that the word has all the attributes and qualities of the God in clause 2, while remaining personally distinct. In other words, while the word is God, he alone does not encapsulate God. God is more than just the word, subsisting in three persons, not just one. The word is fully God, but God is not fully the word. So in conclusion, which translation is right? Clearly the ESV correctly translates the verse, "The Word was God." Now that being said, the danger with this translation is that people may assume that God is being used as a definite, and equate the word with the God in clause 2. So another good translation is the way that NET renders the verse, "and the Word was fully God." It's interesting that John begins his gospel by affirming that Jesus was eternally God before his incarnation, affirms he is still God during his incarnation, and forms an inclusio at the end of his book with Thomas's confession that Jesus was God after his resurrection.